At the center of this world stood a mansion larger than any other, a palace of towering columns and gilded gates. It belonged to Obinna, the wealthiest man in Ezioma, and within its walls lived Amara, the woman every village girl envied. Once Amara had been no different from the daughters of the land. She had carried water from the streams, woven mats beneath the shade of mango trees, and lived by the simple rhythm of village life. But fate had taken her by the hand and placed her in a world far removed from the one she knew. Obinna had chosen her, lifting her from obscurity and placing her beside him as his wife. To those outside, it was a dream realized, a village girl turned queen, draped in silk and adorned with gold. Women whispered of her fortune, speaking of grand feasts, lavish jewels, and a life untouched by hardship. They envied the ease with which she had stepped into a world they could only imagine. But envy is born from what the eyes see, not what the heart knows. Beyond the gates of Obinna's mansion, the air was heavy with silence. The golden halls, polished to perfection, reflected the illusion of grandeur. Yet within them, Amara walked as a prisoner, her world reduced to carefully measured steps and quiet obedience. Obinna's presence was an unspoken command, dictating the rhythm of the household. His word was absolute, his authority unquestioned. Servants moved with practiced precision, their eyes lowered, their voices hushed. None dared defy him, for they had seen what happened to those who did. Amara existed in this world, but it was not hers to control. Every decision, what she wore, where she went, even the thoughts she expressed, belonged to Obinna. She was a possession more than a partner, a symbol of his power rather than a woman of her own will. When she smiled, it was for the benefit of others. When she spoke, it was with words carefully chosen to avoid his displeasure. The walls of the mansion gleamed like gold, but a cage, no matter how beautiful, remains a cage. Obinna was not merely rich, he was feared. His wealth had not been built on kindness, nor had his influence been earned with goodwill. In business, he was ruthless, leaving ruin in his wake. Those who opposed him were crushed beneath the weight of his power, their names fading into whispers of caution. He was a man whose victories were measured not in prosperity, but in the destruction of those who stood in his way. Even in marriage, he ruled with an iron grip. Amara was not his wife. She was his conquest, a woman who had entered his world as an outsider and remained in it at his mercy. He viewed her not as an equal, but as a possession, something to be controlled, displayed, and silenced when necessary. The town of Ezioma spoke of his greatness, but behind closed doors, his shadow loomed long and suffocating. Then, without warning, the world shifted. Obinna was dead. The news spread like wildfire, reaching every corner of Ezioma. The town, accustomed to his dominance, stood in stunned disbelief. A man who had built an empire, who had shaped destinies with the mere flick of his hand, was now lifeless, cold, reduced to nothing but memory. His funeral was a spectacle of wealth and mourning, a golden coffin carried by men dressed in black, a procession of luxury cars trailing behind. Businessmen, politicians, and strangers who had once feared him now stood in public grief. They mourned not only the man, but the power he had wielded. Yet among the sea of wailing voices, one figure remained silent. Amara stood at the edge of the grave, her veil drawn low, her expression unreadable. While others wept, she did not shed a single tear. The people of Ezioma whispered among themselves. Was it grief that had robbed her of her voice, or was it something else? Her silence spoke louder than any cry. It unsettled them, unsettled those who had long believed that a wife should mourn her husband openly, regardless of the life she had lived with him. And in the quiet spaces between their whispers, a question began to form. The rumors did not fade. If anything, they grew stronger. The town, once in awe of Amara's fortune, now looked upon her with suspicion. Had she simply endured her suffering until fate intervened, or had she taken matters into her own hands? In Ezioma, justice was not always just, and the truth was not always what mattered. What mattered were the whispers that filled the air, the stories people chose to believe. And as the sun set over the grand mansion, now draped in mourning, one thing remained certain. Though Obinna was gone, his shadow had not yet faded. Ezioma had long been a town where power spoke louder than truth, and in that world no name carried more weight than Obinna. His wealth did not come from kindness, nor was it built on honesty. He was a man whose empire stood tall, casting long shadows over those who dared to defy him. In public, he was a businessman, a leader, a man of influence. But behind the golden facade, whispers carried stories of ruin, betrayal, and silent disappearances. The people of Ezioma had learned one thing over the years. Obinna was not a man to be questioned. Those who tried soon found themselves swallowed by the darkness that followed him. Some lost their businesses overnight, reduced to beggars on the streets. Others packed their belongings and vanished before the sun could rise. And then there were those who simply ceased to exist, their names spoken only in hushed voices, as if even the mention of them could summon doom. But of all the ghosts trailing Obinna's footsteps, none was as unsettling as the story of Neka. His first wife had once been the pride of Ezioma, a woman whose beauty and grace had captured the hearts of many. Yet, one day, she was gone. Her death came suddenly, without warning, and with it a silence that spoke louder than words. Those who wondered aloud were met with sharp glances and quiet warnings. Did she fall ill? Did she try to leave? No one dared ask. And just like that, her name faded, as if she had never lived at all. Within the grand walls of Obinna's mansion, fear had become a language spoken fluently by those who served him. The maids, the guards, the cooks, each one knew that a wrong step, a misplaced word, could cost them everything. They moved like shadows, careful, unseen, never looking into the eyes of the master they feared. And so, when death finally came for him, it was not grief that filled the air, but uncertainty. For even in the grave, Obinna's secrets remained alive, waiting to be unearthed. Amara knew this truth better than anyone. To the world, she was the fortunate village girl who had married into wealth, lifted from a life of struggle into golden luxury. They envied her, whispered of her luck. But behind closed doors, Amara knew what it meant to be caged within riches. She had once been a woman of light, full of dreams and laughter. But in Obinna's house, that light had dimmed, replaced by the quiet resignation of a woman trapped in a prison no one could see. What had begun as love had quickly turned into control. Every decision, every move she made was watched, dictated, controlled. Obinna's jealousy had poisoned his mind, twisting into paranoia that left no space for her own thoughts, her own desires. She had once tried to reach out, to seek help, but each attempt ended in punishment, sometimes in words, sometimes in silence that cut deeper than any blade. The mansion's golden walls stood high, but they were nothing more than bars of a cage. And then there were the other women, Obinna's mistresses, the ones he entertained in secrecy, but never hid from her. He had taught her early that betrayal was a privilege reserved for him alone. While he indulged in his affairs, Amara knew that even a glance in another man's direction could cost her everything. Her dignity, her freedom, perhaps even her life. There was no escape. Even if she ran, where would she go? She had nothing. Obinna had ensured that. The wealth, the assets, even the accounts. His hands were in everything, leaving her powerless, and he never failed to remind her of the cost of disobedience. "If you ever think of leaving," he had once whispered, his voice as calm as it was cruel, "you won't be the only one to suffer." But fate, like the rivers that carved through the land, had a way of changing course. One night, As the wind howled through the empty halls of the mansion, Amara found herself drawn to Obinna's study. The room that had always remained locked, untouched, as if it held secrets too dangerous to be seen. And there, tucked away in the shadows of his desk, she found it. A document fragile with age but heavy with truth. His will. But it was not the one he had shown the world. Her hands trembled as she unfolded the pages. There, in clear ink, was the proof that shattered whatever illusions remained. She had never been meant to inherit anything, not a single coin, not a single piece of the empire she had suffered under. In death, just as in life, Obinna had ensured that she would walk away with nothing. Yet fate was not without mercy. In the depths of the document lay something else, something far more dangerous. A mistake, a hidden account, linked to names she recognized from the whispers of the town, business dealings that could not stand the light of day, transactions that, if revealed, would bring down not only Obinna's empire, but the men who had once bowed before him. And in that moment, Amara saw it clearly. The pattern, the way Obinna had eliminated his enemies, the way he had buried Neka's memory, the way he had tightened his grip on her. She was next. She had always been next. The paranoia, the control. It had been growing, creeping closer. He had been preparing just as he had before. Her time was running out. She could run, but there was no safety in fleeing. She could fight. But how does one defeat a ghost of a man whose reach still lingered beyond the grave? Number to survive, she had to change the game. She had to become something else, something stronger. She had to become the hunter. And for the first time in years, Amara felt something stir within her, a fire that had long been smothered. The beginning of the end had arrived. The night sky groaned under the weight of a storm, its fury rolling through the heavens like an angry god beating his drum. The wind tore through the trees, bending them like cowed servants, while rain lashed against the earth in relentless waves. Thunder cracked across the sky, shaking the very foundations of the grand mansion that loomed over the village like a fortress of greed. In the old stories, storms were omens, voices of the ancestors warning of great change. And on this night, the spirits were restless. Inside the mansion, candle flames trembled, casting long, wavering shadows upon the walls. The air was thick, heavy with something unseen, but deeply felt. The servants, wise in the ways of silence, moved with lowered heads and careful steps, as if the very walls had ears. They knew better than to speak when the winds howled like this. But in the heart of the mansion, where power had long reigned unchecked, a different storm was brewing, one that had been waiting for years to be unleashed. Amara stood in the center of the dimly lit study, her breath steady, her hands firm as they clutched the papers that held her fate. She had read them over and over again, each word cutting deeper than the last. This was not a mistake. It was the final betrayal. Footsteps echoed down the hallway, deliberate, unhurried. A presence that had long ruled over her life approached, oblivious to the war that had already begun. The heavy door swung open. Obinna entered, his dark robes flowing around him like the feathers of a vulture. His eyes, sharp as a blade, swept over the room before landing on her. He saw the will in her hands. He saw the set of her shoulders, the defiance in her eyes. And he smiled. "You've been busy," he said, his voice smooth, as though he were speaking to a child who had wandered too far from home. But then again, curiosity was always your weakness. Amara did not flinch, not this time. "You planned to leave me with nothing," she said, her voice steady, though her heart pounded like a drum in her chest. "Even in death, you would strip me of everything. You swore before the elders that I was your wife, yet you made certain I would walk away with nothing but dust and shame." Obinna sighed, stepping closer. "I gave you everything, Amara. A life beyond your station, riches you never dreamed of. Did you think that made you my equal? She tightened her grip on the papers. I was never your wife, was I? Just another possession. Like the land you took, like the people you crushed under your feet. His eyes darkened. The amusement faded, replaced by something colder. You do not understand power, woman. That is why you were never meant to have it. Amara held up the will. And if I show them this, if the world sees the truth? For the first time, a shadow flickered across Obinna's face, a crack in the stone. Fear. It was brief, almost invisible, but she saw it, and he saw that she had. The storm roared outside, shaking the windows as the wind battered against the mansion. Inside, another fury took shape. Obinna moved with the swiftness of a man who had spent his life crushing opposition. One moment he was across the room. The next, his hand was striking the papers from hers, sending them fluttering to the floor like broken wings. You think a piece of paper will save you? His voice was a growl now, no longer the measured tones of a king in control of his court. You think you can challenge me? Amara did not step back. She did not cower. You are already dead, Obinna, she whispered, and you know it. Something inside him snapped. With a roar, he reached for the blade that always rested on his desk, a small curved knife, its edge gleaming even in the dim candlelight. His grip was sure, his intention clear. Amara had seen that look before. She had felt the weight of his wrath in words, in silence, in the cold calculations that had made her a prisoner within her own home. But never like this. Never with death. The night sky groaned under the weight of a gathering storm, its fury rolling through the heavens like an angry god beating his drum. The wind tore through the trees, bending them like cowed servants, while rain lashed against the earth in relentless waves. Thunder cracked across the sky, shaking the very foundations of the grand mansion that loomed over the village like a fortress of greed. In the old stories, storms were omens, voices of the ancestors warning of great change, and on this night the spirits were restless. Inside the mansion, candle flames trembled, casting long, wavering shadows upon the walls. The air was thick, heavy with something unseen but deeply felt. The servants, wise in the ways of silence, moved with lowered heads and careful steps, as if the very walls had ears. They knew better than to speak when the winds howled like this. But in the heart of the mansion, where power had long reigned unchecked, another storm was brewing, one that had been waiting for years to be unleashed. Amara stood in the center of the dimly lit study, her breath steady, her hands firm as they clutched the papers that held her fate. She had read them over and over again, each word cutting deeper than the last. This was no mistake. It was the final betrayal. Footsteps echoed down the hallway, deliberate, unhurried. A presence that had long ruled over her life approached, oblivious to the war that had already begun. The heavy door swung open. Obinna entered, his dark robes flowing around him like the feathers of a vulture. His sharp gaze swept over the room before settling on her. He saw the will in her hands. He saw the set of her shoulders, the defiance in her eyes. And he smiled. "You've been busy," he said, his voice smooth, as though addressing a child who had wandered too far from home. But then again, curiosity was always your weakness. Amara did not flinch. Not this time. "You plan to leave me with nothing," she said, her voice steady despite the pounding of her heart. "Even in death, you would strip me of everything. You swore before the elders that I was your wife, yet you made certain I would walk away with nothing but dust and shame." Obinna sighed as he stepped closer. "I gave you everything, Amara. A life beyond your station, riches you never dreamed of. Did you think that made you my equal?" Her fingers tightened around the papers. "I was never your wife, was I? Just another possession, like the land you took, like the people you crushed under your feet." His eyes darkened, amusement fading, replaced by something colder. "You do not understand power, woman. That is why you were never meant to have it." Amara lifted the will. "And if I show them this? If the world sees the truth?" For the first time, a shadow flickered across Obinna's face, a crack in the stone, fear. It was brief, almost invisible, but she saw it, and he saw that she had. The storm roared outside, rattling the windows as the wind battered against the mansion. Inside, another fury took shape. Obinna moved swiftly, like a man accustomed to crushing opposition. One moment he stood across the room. The next he struck the papers from her hands, sending them fluttering to the floor like broken wings. "You think a piece of paper will save you?" The grave was freshly covered, the earth still dark and unsettled. The villagers had come, their faces carved from stone, their eyes unreadable. Some had murmured quiet prayers for the dead. Others had stood in silence, watching, waiting. But now they were gone, leaving only the wind and the whispering trees to keep vigil over the fallen tyrant. Amara stood at the edge of the burial mound, her black mourning robes billowing in the evening breeze. The weight of the past pressed against her chest, as heavy as the soil that buried Obinna. He was gone. The man who had ruled her life with an iron hand, the man who had stolen her freedom, had met his end. And yet she did not feel free. The mansion on the hill belonged to her now, as did the wealth Obinna had hoarded like a dragon guarding its gold. The businesses, the lands, the servants who once bowed to him now turned to her. Power had shifted, but peace had not come with it. For in the land of the living, gold earned through blood never gleamed without the stain of its price. The village did not speak of Obinna's death, but the silence carried a weight heavier than words. At the market square, old men sat beneath the shade of the baobab tree, their voices low, their glances sharp. Women pounded yam with steady hands, but their ears were open, catching the whispers that moved like wind through the village. "It was too easy," one of them murmured. "A man like him does not fall unless the gods will it, or a hand pushes him." An old woman, her back bent with the burden of years, stirred a pot of steaming soup and shook her head. "The river does not swell without reason." No one said Amara's name. No one dared. But the knowing looks, the sidelong glances, those spoke louder than any accusation. Justice in their land did not always wear the robes of the law. Sometimes it was woven into the breath of the people, passed from mouth to mouth until it grew into something undeniable. And so the whispers grew, curling through the village like smoke from a dying fire. Far beyond the village, in a house lined with polished wood and guarded by tall iron gates, Cain sat in silence. Obinna's younger brother had not wept. He had not stood at the grave with the others, pretending to grieve. He had only watched, his sharp eyes missing nothing. He was meant to inherit everything. It was written in blood, in sweat, in the unbreakable bond of kinship. And yet now he had nothing. But he did not believe in fate. He believed in reason, in action. And this was no accident. His fingers drummed against the mahogany desk. "Find out what really happened," he commanded. The men before him, their faces shadowed by the dim candlelight, nodded. "Spare no one," Cain said, his voice quiet but sharp as a blade. "If there is truth hidden in the dark, bring it into the light." Days passed, but the unease did not. One morning, as the sun bled gold over the horizon, Amara sat at her desk, staring at the papers that granted her everything Obinna once owned. The past should have been buried with him, but when she reached for the stack of letters beside her, her fingers froze. One envelope stood out, plain, unmarked. She tore it open. The words inside were few, but they sliced through her like a knife through ripe fruit. "I know what you did. Your fortune is not yours alone. Pay, or the truth will find you." Her hands trembled. The ink was bold, the message clear. But who? How? The storm she thought had passed was only gathering strength. Each night the mansion felt colder. The wide halls, once filled with Obinna's presence, now echoed with something else, something unseen but deeply felt. She searched for the one who had written the letter, but the shadows offered no names. Whoever it was, they were watching, waiting. A secret carried alone is a burden. A secret shared is a noose. The words of her grandmother rang in her ears. She had thought she was free, but freedom, she was beginning to learn, was just another word for survival. One evening, beneath the silver glow of the moon, Amara stood before the grave of the man who had once controlled her life. The wind sighed through the trees, rustling the leaves like whispering tongues. The night was still, but she felt the weight of unseen eyes upon her. She knelt, pressing a palm against the cool earth. "I buried you," she murmured, "but your shadow refuses to die." The wind carried her words away, but she felt them settle in the night air. In the land of the living, the dead were never truly silent, and justice always found a way to return. I hope you enjoyed this story. If you did, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more captivating tales. And tell me in the comments, what lesson did you take from this story? I'd love to hear your thoughts.